All right, welcome back to another episode of the Supply Chaney podcast. My name is Nathan Chaney, and I'll be your host here today on this adventure, talking a little bit about trade compliance and global trade and international business with Lila Landis, who is at the moment here in DFW with me, one of my neighbors across town. And I've gotten to interact with her at a couple of Supply Chain social club events and just gotten to hear about the just amount of expertise and experience that she has, especially in tariffs and global trade and compliance. And I thought no better time than now to bring her on, talk a little bit about her story, her career, and talk about the times that we're living in right now. So, Lila, welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to this. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you, Nathan, so much for having me on. And so I am Lila Landis. I'm a licensed customs broker. I'm certified U.S. export compliance officer, certified global sanctions specialist, and certified compliance and ethics professional international. Been in international trade for over 15 years. And I got my start because I speak Spanish and French as second and third languages. I studied those in high school and in college, and I was majoring in international business. Not quite sure what I was going to do with that. I just knew that I didn't want to be a teacher and I didn't really want to be a translator, but I wanted to use my language skills and to travel. I started working in international customer service for an industrial manufacturer focused on Latin America using my Spanish skills. And that led me to learning about freight forwarders and Incoterms and export documents and export licenses. And thought, this is pretty cool. This is really interesting. From there, I was promoted into an inside sales role in that same organization and was again focused on Latin America. And they said, hey, we've got all these customers asking for these NAFTA certificates, and we don't know what these are, but you go figure it out. So I didn't know anything about NAFTA at the time, but I figured out how to learn about it. I was living in Milwaukee at that time, and I went to the Milwaukee World Trade Association, and they had some free NAFTA training. So I took that and just felt that I'd caught the bug. I really loved trade compliance and wanted to make that my career. And so that's when I pursued my broker's license. I did an MBA with a focus on international business and did some study abroads during that and built a career out of building compliance programs. And I've gotten to work for some really cool companies and interesting industries along the way. Because my dad was in the Navy. And so then I was born in Florida, but I have lived in a whole bunch of other states. And so I lived in Florida and in Massachusetts, back to Florida, to Texas, Virginia, South Carolina, Illinois, you know. And so, it used to be really hard for me to answer that question, but I figured out, over the past 10 years or so that everyone thinks that I'm Midwestern because they hear the O in my voice. And so then clearly I'm Midwestern. So I'm from Illinois. That's where I spent the most amount of time. That's where I went to high school, and I very much identify with Midwestern culture. So that's where I'm essentially from. But I was a Navy brat growing up, so I grew up on Navy bases. My dad was out to sea a lot. But the good part of that is, he would come home and he would tell about all of these amazing places that he got to go to. We went to France and Italy and Egypt and Australia, and that was really what drew me to want to be able to travel and do more with international business growing up. As I heard about all of these cool places that he got to go to through the Navy, and I wanted to do that too.
That's a cool story, like a cool inspiration for what would ultimately be your career, I guess that covers the globe, and to have that early on. What kinds of things were you thinking you wanted to be when you grow up? Do you recall, like, did you ever go through that teacher phase or that astronaut phase or anything like that?
I think I had a marine biologist phase,
Okay.
where I thought, maybe I'd be a marine biologist. I thought maybe I'd grow up and be an actress. That seemed like fun. Getting to try on all sorts of different things. But a lot of it, I can't say that there was one thing that I was always sure that I was going to be. I knew that I wanted that opportunity to be able to travel and to see the world.
Gotcha. Can you talk a little bit about the like kind of entering and transitioning from high school, where I guess maybe that was in Illinois, and like make transitioning into to school and education and how you went about that process?
Yeah, I think, for me, really did a non-traditional route. I was working full time during my last year of high school because I was helping to support my family at that time. And so then I ended up having to finish my high school studies through a correspondence course. From there, then I started at a community college to be able to work on my associate's degree. And, it kind of has a bad rap, I think, community colleges as being a dead end, that people go there, they take some college courses and they never really do anything with it. But for me, it was just a way to save some money before going on to doing my bachelor's degree. So I did my associate's degree in community college. Shout out to College of Lake County, Illinois. I got my associate's degree there. I transferred that to Alverno College in Milwaukee, and I was able to do night and weekend classes there while I worked full time doing my bachelor's in international business. And so that was rough, like working a full-time 9 to 5 job and then going directly from work to school and being in
Yeah.
class from 6 to 9 and then going home, falling into bed. But it was definitely worth it. And so I was able to get my bachelor's in international business and then later on went back to school and did my MBA.
I see that. I see that. I would agree with you on the community college sort of the rap that it gets, but I'm also a community college transfer kid as well. Um,
Yeah, there you go.
so I had a great experience. The selling point that I have is that as a freshman and sophomore, I was able to be president of Phi Theta Kappa, the honor society for 2 year schools, and so I was able to be in a leadership position as a freshman and sophomore, which you wouldn't typically get to be at a 4 year college, right? Your juniors and seniors are typically going to have those sort of leadership positions in organizations. So I felt like it was a great incubator to kind of jumpstart what you would be able to accomplish and be able to do it at an earlier point in your college career. Um,
I think I completed my associate's degree, my 2 year degree at community college for about the same cost as one semester at a private 4 year college.
yeah,
So it's definitely a big cost savings.
that too, for sure. So you were in Houston for your MBA. I'm currently working on my MBA right now. I've got 4 classes left, 3 classes
Woo-hoo!
this semester. So I'm keeping
Congrats.
myself busy with that. Can you just talk a little bit about like that decision to take the next step and get a master's and maybe like what you're up to these days, education wise?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I decided that I wanted to make trade compliance my career, one of the things that I did is I used LinkedIn to go and look at people who were senior in the field of trade compliance. I wanted to look at their resumes essentially and see,
Yeah.
what did they do? How did they get there? So I looked at people who were directors of trade compliance or VPs of trade compliance and, really looked at what kind of education did they have, what certifications, kind of experience, what are the projects that they talk about having worked on? And I kept seeing common themes popping up of a broker's license, an MBA, and certified US export compliance officer. That seemed really like the trifecta of what I was seeing in all of the high level people in the field. And so then that's what I set out to go do. So I worked on my broker's license first and was able to do that. And then I needed to do an MBA, but I was already working full time and I couldn't afford to just, completely stop working and go to school, full time in an MBA program that assumes that you're not a working professional. So I needed to find something that worked for me. And I was really fortunate to find the MBA program from University of Houston, Victoria that was focused on international business and really had a lot of international components to the classes and was available to do online. And so I felt like I lucked out with getting to do that. And it was a wonderful program to go through. I did get to do a couple of study abroads. While I did that, I spent 2 weeks in China during my time at UHV. And then also through Midwestern State University, I did a month in London. And so got to do a number of different international lectures there in the UK. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Um,
Nice.
but then recently, in the last few years, I started thinking about kind of what I needed to have for the rest of my career. I'm maybe about halfway through my working years, I think, and was thinking about the second half of my career and decided that I really wanted to pursue a JD. I had thought about law school for a while, but there hadn't been a good opportunity for me to do that because, again, law school is one where typically they're assuming that you're just in law school full time and that is your job, right? And I don't have the ability to do that. And now I have young kids. I have a 4-year-old son and I have twin 2-year-old girls, and I can't just, attend classes in person because I'm busy taking care of them in addition to working. So I found an online program from Purdue Global. It's a fully online JD program, and just felt that that was going to be a really good fit to enhance my skills. I don't intend to go become a trial lawyer or doing personal injury work. That's not what I'm doing. I really just want to be able to better understand and apply the regulations that we deal with in trade compliance all the time. We're trade compliance professionals are already reading 19 CFR, 15 CFR, and 22 CFR all the time for what you're dealing with, import and export. I think a law degree just enables you to better be able to understand the way that those are written, do research into, how those have been interpreted by the courts, and be able to apply them to the facts of the situation you're working with.
Yeah, I feel like you are, concocting the ultimate sort of, trade compliance and international trade resume there, adding the JD in now, because when I think of everyone that participates in the supply chain process, it's those international business folks and the compliance and trade folks that to me are the closest things to lawyers sitting at the table because of the complexity and just the volume of rules and regulations and policies that have to be followed. Like you all are the smart people in the room already. I think whenever those kind of conversations are being had. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it's kind of a difficult position because in some organizations, trade compliance is part of the legal department. And this is one of the questions that I get asked is, where does trade compliance belong in an organization? And there's really no one right answer because it depends on the organization itself. But oftentimes it does get put in legal. And sometimes that's a good thing because legal can lend gravitas to trade compliance, the
Mhm.
weight of legal, the respect that legal gets within the organization. That can be great. Sometimes, though, it's a downside because if the trade compliance folks are the only non lawyers within the legal department, then sometimes some lawyers have a bad habit of thinking that non lawyers clearly don't know anything at all because they're
Yeah.
not lawyers, right? And so then that can be difficult where, you know, a lawyer, I respect that they're a lawyer and they have a JD and they have to pass the bar and all of that. But if they don't have experience working with the specific regulations that I'm dealing with, if they don't know customs or BIS or OFAC or DDTC the way that I do, then while they have the law degree, they don't have the experience with the specific area of law that we're talking about, right? And so then I might actually be better qualified to answer a question than a lawyer that doesn't have the same experience with those, right? Not every lawyer can practice every area of law because they don't specialize in every area of law. The same as not every trade compliance person can talk about every single, area of trade compliance, right? Don't ask me to classify textiles for you. I don't know the first thing about that. It's just not something that I've done. But if you want free trade agreement information, I can do that all day, right? So different people have different specialties. But yeah, I feel like a legal education is really helpful for trade compliance professionals, but you don't necessarily have to be a lawyer to be able to speak with authority.
Right, right. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Maybe this is a good point of the conversation. You are so the whole idea behind this podcast is to bring voices from across the entire supply chain, from people who are running truck fleets to people that are planning, S&OP and doing everything. And you are, I think, the first voice that's come on that is in this international business, international trade compliance space. Could you kind of define for folks that are maybe not within this part of supply chain what exactly trade compliance is all about, and kind of like walk us through that a little bit, maybe at like a fifth to eighth grade level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like this is one where a lot of times people confuse the roles of trade compliance and logistics, where, they think that logistics people are trade compliance people or trade compliance people are logistics people. And some people do both, but they really are different functions, right? Where to me, and when we're talking about a company that's like an importer exporter, the logistics folks are responsible for facilitating the physical movement of the goods, right? You are reaching out to carriers and freight forwarders and making sure that goods are getting, getting picked up, they're getting transported, they're getting delivered, and facilitating certain types of documents along the way, whether that's commercial invoice, packing list, a certificate of conformance, like whatever that may be, right? And so then there's a lot of nuance and technical skill involved with that. That's logistics. Your trade compliance folks are the ones that are making sure that when you're doing that, that the information you're providing, that you're receiving, and the way that things are being done are in line with the regulations that govern those activities. So you have like US Customs and Border Protection that regulates the way that information needs to be declared for both exports and imports. So on an export, your trade compliance people are making sure that the EEI, your export declaration, is being filed correctly, that you get a copy of that, that you have the right record keeping, that, that if there was an export license involved, that export license has been declared properly, and that the shipment was done under the license, things like that. If it's an import, then they're the ones who are coordinating with the broker, making sure that the import's being declared properly, and answering any questions about classification or country of origin or free trade agreement qualification or things like that. And then making sure that those documents are kept properly and that they're doing all the things like that. So to me, that's kind of the difference between what does a compliance person do versus what does a logistics person do. And they work hand in hand, but they are very different roles and responsibilities.
I'm just hearing you talk right now. I feel like, on the logistics side of the house, from a shipment perspective, you can make a mistake and put a wrong address on where something needs to go. And there's going to be some cost to ship it to the right place after all at the end of the day. But I feel like the mistakes that could be had from a trade compliance perspective could be much more costly to an organization. Could you like talk a little bit about, the difference in quality of when you do a good job at your job and when mistakes are made, and kind of the cost to an organization of that?
Yeah, well, I will say that no compliance program is ever 100% good, right? Like it's just not, because if you do any sort of volume with international shipping, then there are humans in the mix. It's humans are fallible. They're going to make mistakes. And so then you're never going to be at 100%. And you can't let perfect be the enemy of good. So a lot of times compliance professionals are very, very detail oriented, which is kind of a requirement for the job, right?
Right.
But then sometimes they get so focused on things needing to be 100% perfect that then they lose sight of the bigger picture of just trying to make sure that you're doing the best job that you can with what you have. And sometimes there's ambiguity. But as far as the mistakes, there are some mistakes that really are minor, right? Like, and that you can correct. And so one of the things that you can do is on the import side, you have the ability to do, post summary corrections and to correct data in your entry. You can do a protest to correct beyond that. You can do prior disclosures if you discover systemic errors. There's options for you to figure out that you made an error and to try to correct that, right? On the export side too, you can correct, export filings that you've done, export declarations. You can do voluntary disclosures where, you found out that you made a big error and you disclose it in advance to mitigate a penalty. I think the big thing that people run into, the problems they run into is when you're making errors, but you're not catching them because you're not doing any auditing, right? If you're making mistakes, but you're never catching those mistakes and reporting them and fixing them, that's where you're going to get into big trouble with the government, where you're much more likely to get big fines because it's systemic at that point, right? Versus, or when you're just reckless and I'm not paying any attention to what the requirements are because I just don't care enough to do that. And then, then that's another case where the government's going to come down much harder on you for, gross negligence is the legal standard that they apply to say that you're just not paying any attention to what you're doing and not show legal care. But yeah, there's a lot of like simple mistakes that can be, it's a $10,000 fine, $10,000 a fine. Here you go.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
EDI mistakes are like that, right? Where it's very easy to get big mistakes like that. And with a lot of what's going on with tariffs right now, there's going to be a lot more heavy enforcement on the import side because they're going to be looking to get as much of that revenue as they can.
Can you talk a little bit about the enforcement piece of this? Talking to you and talking to other folks, it seems natural that folks that have worked in the industry, in companies or whatnot, are a natural it's a natural career transition to go to that auditing side and that policing side. Is that seen, or like what's the career path look like for the folks that are keeping all the companies in check? And how does that look on that side?
Yeah, there's definitely a very natural transition that happens for folks who have worked in customs or BIS or OFAC or BBTC to transition over to the private sector. And so that can be either some of them, if they're like a lawyer on the side of one of those agencies, it's very easy for them to then go private as a trade lawyer. And where that's a big selling point to say, hey, I've been on the inside. I know
Right.
exactly how customs looks at this. And so then I can help you, get the best possible outcome for your organization. For the non-lawyers, going and working, in trade compliance for an organization, going working in consulting is another big path. And especially, all your big four accounting firms have global trade consulting practices. And so
Okay.
then they hire folks who are ex-government who have those kinds of connections and that inside knowledge of how the agency works to be able to navigate high level issues with the agency. So there's really good career paths for people who have worked on the government side to then go and have good careers in the private sector for sure.
And is the reverse also true, that folks that have been in the private side to go to the government side?
I
Or
don't see that as much, not
okay,
in trade. Not that it doesn't happen or that it can't happen, but generally that's not something that I see very much. It tends to be more so people start their career in a government role,
okay.
spend a good amount of time on the government side, and then go private. I don't see it happen as often where someone is private, in the private sector and then goes into a government.
I see. I see. Given, and then the next part of this, I guess, topic here, based on what you were talking about a while ago, about things needing to ramp up due to just the volume of changes and modifications happening these days, does that policing force, on the government side, on the auditing side, is that being stepped up in an intelligent way to be able to keep all the eyes on the balls going up right now? Or like, how does that look from that perspective? You see?
It's there's a lot of conflicting information out there, as you can imagine, right? There's conflicting information about the tariffs themselves, and so there's conflicting information about what's really going on inside of CBP right now. So we know that the customs part of Customs and Border Protection was part of the offer for the deferred resignations, right? So
Uh-huh.
the big purge of government staff that happened in January, February, March time frame. So we know that people within CBP received those offers, and some of them presumably took that, but we don't know specifically, what happened there. We also know that with the return to office mandate for federal government employees, that's affecting CBP as well, because you had a number of CBP staff that were working remotely. And so then some of them are not going to be with CBP any longer. The border protection side of the house and should have been exempt from the offer, but it wasn't always something that was done super efficiently. Or ironic for a Department of Government Efficiency. But there's people who received the offer that shouldn't have been eligible for it. So it's not really clear how much that has affected the staffing at CBP,
Yeah.
but what we're seeing publicly is they're saying that they will be stepping up enforcement efforts, that they're going to be putting a lot of resources on making sure that they are collecting every bit of the new tariffs that are owed. So I would expect that we're going to see anybody who's changing their country of origin away from China, you should expect CF-28s asking you for more information. If not, going to full scale, focused assessments or auditing or more in-depth investigations if it's really on a big scale. This is a place where I would expect them to put resources because they want to be able to show that they're collecting a significant amount of revenue from these new tariffs, because part of the justification for the tariffs is they want this to offset the cost of doing new tax cuts.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I think I think we're starting to talk about a good volume of transactions that need to all be looked at, and very complex. I think this is maybe one of those areas where AI can come in and really help kind of connect all the pieces and do some of that auditing that maybe used to be more manual. Like, can you kind of talk a little bit about
Mhm.
how AI is playing a role in, both on the private side, I guess, as a practitioner, but also on that auditing side? What's going on there?
Yeah. So on the government side, they are using AI. They are using AI for parts of things. They're not using AI in this really big interconnected meta sense, right? It's not like, they're applying AI to all of the data that they have and connecting the dots. And government really works very siloed. Anyone who has had to deal with multiple government agencies discovers this really quickly. Even within CBP, one office doesn't necessarily always talk to the other about what's going on. But ACE, which is the automated commercial environment, it's the single window system for US Customs. It transformed really the way the customs works in a lot of ways in terms of giving them access to a much greater volume of data than they ever had before. And so one of the things that I've been telling, importers for years, ever since the first Trump tariffs of 2017 is, if you are suddenly changing the country of origin that you've declared on imports for years, they will know that. Customs will know that. And it doesn't take a person manually looking at your imports to be able to make that decision. The system is going to flag that for that. Right? That's the kind of change that the system can flag. They're also partnered with a number of other companies, private companies, that are using AI to be able to help provide more information as well. So one of the things that they're doing is on the forced labor side, and they partner with an AI company that's focused on trade compliance to be able to give them greater insight into all of the links of the supply chain and to be able to identify shipments that are possibly made with forced labor. So there's
Wow.
definitely AI tools being used by the government to be able to identify either changes to your data that flag that you may be trying to evade tariffs, or things like, forced labor concerns. On the private side, it used to be that every time I heard a company, do a sales pitch about using AI in trade compliance, that what they were describing was not at all AI, right? And I'm not a computer programmer by any means. I can't write code, but I do have an interest in the use of technology. And so then I know enough to know when you're talking about AI versus you're talking about just an algorithm that is
Yeah.
pulled with business requirements, right? And they were not using true machine learning years ago. They were just, it was just basically programming a decision tree into
Yeah.
software, which
Decision
is
tree.
not
Yeah.
AI. Nowadays, there are real AI companies applying this to trade compliance to be able to do things. And I've seen some pretty cool examples where they've been able to use AI to do classifications. Saw one example that they were able to show me where the software knew the difference between chips that were being imported from Frito-Lay, and that those were potato chips under this classification, versus chips that were being imported by Intel, and those were computer chips under this
Mm.
classification, right? So really cool stuff going on in that environment. I think, it can seem really daunting. I think for a lot of trade compliance folks who maybe are still managing a lot of their trade compliance functions through just Excel, you know, that into the idea of using AI. But I think it's something that everybody should be exploring. What are some good options for them to be able to better manage their data?
Gotcha. Let's maybe, here, as we're kind of rounding third base here, into home, let's talk a little bit about the times that we're living in now, and some of your observations and insights, I guess, on just the state of import and export and international commerce, and the, you know, the US's sort of the play that we're running right now, and kind of like your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, I feel like every trade compliance professional should be adding dealing with ambiguity to their resume, right? And that should be a skill that we all have on our resume right now, because it sure ever a time of a lot of ambiguity where you have, tariff announcements changing from one date to the next, and it's, what was said on Truth Social or on the news versus what is in the executive order versus what is in the Federal Register. It's just a very confusing time. But I think one of the things that I think trade compliance professionals should make sure that they're taking to heart and communicating to others within their organization is that this is not a temporary blip, that this is the tariffs are part of a long-term strategy to return domestic manufacturing to the US. And this is not something that is just being postured for negotiations for a better free trade agreement. And all of this is my opinion, right? But
Yeah,
I feel
right.
like it's opinion that is backed up with a lot of information that's out there. But I mean, look at the USTR report, United States Trade Representative report that was released, recently. Look at the official White House reports on trade that have come out within the past couple of months. And if you read their trade policy, this is exactly what they're telling you: is that this is designed to return domestic manufacturing to the US. And so then we can't look at this as something that we're just going to wait out for a year or two and then it's gonna blow over and go away. I think this needs to be treated as the new normal. And how do we best support our organizations through that? What is the way that we can mitigate risk? What is the way that we can mitigate costs? How do we support our sourcing and procurement folks when they're looking at changing their sourcing, based on the tariffs that are there, but really looking at it as strategic and long term and what we can do to help organizations through it.
I think in the last 24 hours, and again, by the time this podcast comes out, who knows what this is going to all be like. But just the most recent news right now is that it seems like some countries are coming back to the table and saying, okay, well, if you drop these tariffs that you're saying that you're going to put on us, then we'll take them off you, and just everyone just put all your tariffs away, and we're just going to go totally free trade completely. Is there validity to that? Does that seem likely? What are your
The
thoughts there?
I mean, some countries are offering that. I know Israel offered to remove all tariffs on all U.S. goods, and President Trump said, "Thanks, and we're still going to keep the tariffs on Israeli goods."
Mhm.
That that it's not going anywhere, because the tariffs aren't the point. The tariffs are a tool, right? The retaliatory tariffs are not put in place to be able to lower the tariffs on U.S. goods abroad. The retaliatory tariffs are put in place to be able to stop companies from importing foreign goods and make them here instead. And so then it's great that other countries are trying to negotiate, but I don't think it's really going to get them anywhere. And then you have the other side. China put retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods in response to the increased tariffs on Chinese goods. President Trump has said that if they don't remove those, that there will be an additional 50% tariff on China. But China has reaffirmed that they're not removing those tariffs, and so now we seem likely to see an additional 50%. So now, after keeping score, then we're up to either 104% tariffs or
Yep.
129% tariffs, depending on whether or not the additional 25% for purchasers of Venezuelan oil are going to be applied to that equation or not. But that's at least doubling the cost of Chinese goods being imported to the US. That's
Yeah.
starting to get to the point where if you have an alternative source domestically, the cost is probably going to make sense at that point, right? And that's what they're trying to get to anyway. There are some goods where there's not already another domestic source. And so
Right.
then that's what I'm more interested to see, is if you have businesses making the kind of long-term decisions to greenfield manufacturing here. And I'm not sure that they're ready to do that.
I feel like, on the one, this is like the world's biggest global scale version of a game of chicken, I suppose, ever. And then on the other side is I think maybe I've heard from Apple specifically saying, like, our supply chain is what it is, and we will continue to operate the way we've been operating, regardless of what kind of changes are coming up. So I think some people are going to just kind of stick to their guns and
Yeah, a
not,
lot of it
yeah,
Yeah, a lot of it's going to be, specific from one industry to the next too, because they have to look at the price elasticity of their goods, right? Where, they need to be looking at how sensitive are consumers to the price of my goods, right? Can Apple still sell a good volume of iPhones if their iPhones are $1,500 or $2,000 versus $1,000? They
yeah,
probably can't, because they've
yeah,
already gotten to the point where, it's over $1,000 and people are still buying them and they're still making huge profits. So they're probably looking at this and going, we can take it, right? We're going to keep the manufacturing facilities that we have. We're not going to spend billions of dollars in capital to create new manufacturing facilities in the US with workers, that we don't already have trained, right? When we already have this great contract manufacturing system set up.
yeah,
And so then they're not going to do it. Versus things like apparel, where you don't have significant domestic sources of apparel, right, for the US. But it's one where customers are a lot more sensitive to price on apparel than they are on an iPhone.
Yeah.
And so then, when you can no longer buy, $5 shirt off of an e-commerce website, is that going to be something where consumers start turning and looking for a domestic source that can give them a $5, $10 t-shirt rather than a 20 or $30 t-shirt? Right. So it's going to vary a lot, I think, from one industry to the next, because they're going to have to look at that price elasticity, what's going to happen to supply and demand at different levels of prices.
From a manufacturing perspective, I see this from my view as, okay, if we bring back work and manufacturing here, it's going to be the stuff that is most easily automated because of the price of labor, and like just the career paths that younger entry level workers in the workforce want to do. It's not repeat, stamp licking over and over and over type work. And that's the easiest to automate. So I feel like if you're in the automation and manufacturing space and you have that capability to build factories here in the US, I think this is probably a really good time for you. Uh,
Yeah, I think part of that though depends on units, right? So if you look at like auto manufacturing facilities in other countries versus auto manufacturing facilities here, they've automated a lot more of the processes for auto manufacturing in other countries than they have here. Part of that is based on union rules, right? And so then
yeah,
depending on what kind of industry we're talking about, if their workers are covered by a union, then their ability to do that in an automated way may be limited by union rules, right? So that's something to think about. But I mean, textiles is one where, there's a lot of that stuff that it would be great if you can automate, not because I'm saying I want fewer jobs, but really because it's dangerous.
yeah,
Textile manufacturing is dangerous work where people legitimately get seriously injured. And so there's some things like that. The other thing is like rare earth minerals. So one of the ways that China could really hurt the US if they decide to go this route is by restricting their exports of rare earth minerals much more than they have done so far, because those are necessary for our electronics manufacturing, and they're something that we don't produce very much at domestically. We do have sources of rare earth minerals here in the US, but it's very dirty and dangerous and difficult to be able to extract them.
yeah.
And so then that's something again where maybe you can apply some technology and some innovation and automation to that to make it easier or better for us to be able to mine our own sources of rare earth minerals to provide a domestic source for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we could probably continue on this, but maybe here in the last minute or two, is there any, I guess, final things you would like to leave folks with? Any topics that we didn't talk about today that we want to kind of make sure we get out there on the podcast before we adjourn for the day?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot. I would just say that be everybody be kind to your fellow trade compliance professional right now. They're going through a lot, and it's a really chaotic time for logistics, for supply chain, for trade compliance professionals. And so I think we all gotta support each other, commiserate when we can, and just do what we can to get through this and adjust to new normal.
Yeah. Yeah, which again, that kind of goes back to that concept of the only constant is change, and I guess we're really all feeling that in a really real way these days. Um, so thanks for coming on the podcast today, Lila, and sharing some of your experience and expertise from the trade compliance and global and international business perspective. I'll see you around town here in DFW sometime.
Thank you so much for having me, Nathan. I appreciate it.